So it definitely is a very strange Final Four, and it speaks a lot to the changing of the guard in college basketball, right? I mean, we have a Final Four that has Texas, UConn, San Diego State, and Florida Atlantic. Now, either San Diego State or Florida Atlantic is going to get to the national title game, okay? I think they're going to play UConn, but that's a separate discussion and things like that. And I believe Florida Atlantic is a program that has no players currently in the NBA and hasn't ever had a draft pick in the NBA. So, again, Cinderella story out of nowhere. But when you look at San Diego State, Florida Atlantic, even Texas, and, certainly the one blue blood in there is UConn, you don't get this in college football, right? And you would think that with the NC, with the portal, with NIL money, and all of these things now at the disposal of college basketball, just like in college football, that you would get these real powerhouse programs that are at the top of the heap, right? I mean, even the number one overall seed in this year's NCAA tournament was Alabama, a non-traditional basketball program. So again, Alabama had a really good year, but if they're in the Final Four, they still wouldn't have been a traditional basketball power. And it's not that way in college football. Yeah, TCU is a team that got into the national title game, but if you look at the last few years, Alabama, Clemson, Georgia, Michigan, Ohio State, like those are the programs that are at the top of the heap, right? And that's not to take anything away from TCU, but those are the programs that are at the top of the heap. You'd never see a Florida Atlantic in the Final Four of college football, right? They would certainly never get to that level. And as we expand the playoffs in college football, it's going to be fascinating to see where this thing kind of shakes out. Do we get a team that comes out of nowhere, Cinderella story, and they rise up and they find themselves in a title game when you have multiple rounds of a, college football tournament or whatever you want to call it, playoff, when all is said and done. But it is very strange. Now, look, San Diego State has been a really good program over the last handful of years, right? I mean, when Steve Fisher was there, like they were really good teams out there. But do you look at them as kind of a do you think, did anybody have in their bracket San Diego State and Florida Atlantic? I don't think anybody had that. I can't even imagine that you had those two teams. And it does speak to a little bit of where college basketball is at, that we don't have those great dominant teams. I was looking at the 1991 finals of the Final Four, right? It was UNLV versus Duke. So that's Larry Johnson and Stacey Augmon and those guys against Hurley and Leitner and Grant Hill and all those guys. And then on the other side, you had Kansas versus North Carolina. And I believe that North Carolina team, even in 91, still had 8 guys that went to the NBA. They had George Lynch and Chilcutt and Eric Montrose and all of those guys on their roster, right? I mean, that's not even Michael Jordan and all those guys, but they still had like 8 guys that went to the NBA when all was said and done. And that's, again, I understand it's 30 years ago, but still, when you look at this Final Four of these teams that are in there, it kind of does leave you scratching your head about where the state of college basketball is. And look, the TV ratings were off the chart for the first 2 rounds of the tournament, right? Because I do think in college basketball world, it's way more open. And I'm certainly rooting for a Florida Atlantic. I was rooting for Butler, to win the NCAA title. I'm rooting for Florida Atlantic all the way. I want to see one of these low-tier kind of teams. And I say that in comparison to Carolina and Kansas and Duke and, right, all of those teams. But it is amazing that, Miami's not a traditional basketball power. UConn is a traditional basketball power. That's the one program that's the true blue blood that's in there. Multiple NCAA champions. But even they were a lot of teams, a lot of people, I should say, thought that they could be a Final Four team. But I still think it was kind of a little bit of a surprising run. And the fact that I think it's the first time since 06 that we don't have any number one seeds in the tournament, or sorry, in the Final Four, it just kind of speaks to the parity of it. And I wonder if the same thing will translate over to college football, because I still think that it's going to be the Bamas and the Georgias and the Michigans and the Ohio States, and those are going to be the program powers, right? Again, I even in Oregon, if you count an Oregon or something like that, that's still been a football power over the last decade, right? I mean, they have been in the national title hunt over the last decade. It's kind of like Gonzaga in the world of college basketball. They're not just a kind of, what do I want to say, a second tier kind of program anymore in college basketball. They're one of the elite programs. It's not a program at the level of, whatever, North Carolina, Duke, or one of the Blue Bloods or things like that. But Gonzaga is a very, very good program. Oregon's a very, very good football program. Even TCU is a good football program, but maybe kind of they surprised everybody by getting to the national championship game. But it does say a lot about where we are at in the sport of college football. Yes, people are watching. They I think it was record numbers for the first two rounds of the NCAA tournament as far as viewership goes. And even though that there's True TV and CBS and all these kind of things, it doesn't matter. People found it, and people were, motivated to watch the first two rounds. And I think that speaks to the parity of what goes on in the world of college basketball. So it may be a changing of the guard. Carolina was the number one team going into the basketball season, and they didn't even make the NCAA tournament. Now, think about that. Think about Carolina. Could you imagine Carolina being preseason number one and not making the NCAA tournament? Like, that's something from the 1970s, right? Because when you only had 32 teams in the tournament, yeah, you could have, in 74, when it was Maryland versus NC State, and they were number one versus number three in the country, and it was a one bid league at that point. Yeah, then when it's a one bid league in the ACC at that point, and Maryland loses in maybe the greatest college basketball game in ACC history, they lose and they're out of the tournament. And they were a Final Four team, I think, the year before with John Lucas and Tom McMillan and all those guys. So Len Elmore is another one. But again, it's a real changing of the guard in the NCAA. And I love it. And I'm rooting for Florida Atlantic big time to try to win this thing. All right, let's talk about our friends over at Built Bar. Listen, speaking of March Madness, Built Bar has got your March Madness bracket. Go to builtmarchmadness.com and vote for your favorite bar or puff. builtmarchmadness.com. And when you go over there and vote for your favorite bar or puff, you are registered to be in a deal where 50 lucky Locked On listeners are going to get a free box of Built Bars. So you could potentially be one of 50 winners for a free box of Built Bars. And there's going to be one winner that is a winner of a 12-month subscription to have Built Bars delivered monthly straight to your door. So vote for your favorite bar or puff. Take all of the different flavors that you've got out there and go to builtmarchmadness.com and register to win either a free box of Built Bars or a 12-month subscription where you get Built Bars delivered right to your home.